Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this PestFax webinar. My name is Cindy Webster, and I am the PestFax newsletter editor, and I'm based at the Narrogin Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development Office. I'm hosting the webinar today, working behind the scenes. And this webinar has been funded by DPIRD and GRDC as part of the IPMforGrains project. And now I'm going to move on to today's agenda. Our first presenter, we have Dr. Dusty Stevenson, and he is an entomologist based at the Northern DPIRD office. And Dusty is going to be talking to us about insect lessons learnt from 2019, what Greenbridge pests that growers are to look out for at crop emergence, as well as the fall armyworm. We then have DPIRD entomologist Svetlana Michic, who is based at Albany. And Svetlana is going to be talking about non-Greenbridge pests, red-legged earth mite insecticide resistance, as well as a new bait that is registered for European earwigs, splatters and millipedes, and then slugs and snail management. I will then be talking about the PestFax service, and as well as some other useful apps and resources that are available for growers and consultants to use in their insect management this season. We will be having a question and answer session at the end, just to make sure that all the presentation content is delivered on time. And as you may have heard me already say, we are keeping all attendees, except for the presenters, muted, just to try and improve the sound quality of the webinar. But we are really keen to get your questions. And to do this, we are asking you to use the chat section of your control panel. As you can see on the picture on the screen, if you just select the down arrow next to chat, enter your question in the panel there, and then perhaps write the presenter's name that you want to ask the question to. And then next to the two, can you just click send questions to staff, click send, and then at the end of the webinar, I'll be reading the questions out loud and the presenters will answer them. And attendees can also use this chat section to just let me know if you're having any technical difficulties, and I will see if I can help you behind the scenes while the webinar is taking place. And just so that you don't feel like you need to madly scribble down everything that it's been said, we will be circulating a recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint slides afterwards to all attendees. So please sit back and relax, and I will now hand over the webinar to Dusty.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us for this webinar. I just wanted to start off with some lessons from last year. I think it's good to have some follow-up on some things that were pretty big issues, I think, and we had some sort of resolution. The first thing that was a pretty decent issue for us was considering the late break. So for most areas, we had a break of around 7th of June, I think it was. So this caused some interesting scenarios where crops were sown earlier and insecticide was put down earlier. The mites and lucerne flea hadn't really hatched yet, particularly red-legged earth mites that have the cold temperature requirement, but there was also delayed lucerne flea hatchings and all of this. So particularly crops that didn't really have much follow-up monitoring and we thought maybe they were going to be okay. There was quite a significant amount of damage done to some crops, and even oat hay crops where those lucerne flea had hatched later and caused a bit of wreaked a bit of havoc, but also because of that later germination and the crops were young, sort of coinciding with all this. So this is something obviously that we're going to look out for every year, and Svet's going to talk about this a bit later in terms of why this is really a non-Greenbridge related issue, and we handle this quite differently. The other issue we had was budworm. It was probably the biggest year for budworm I can remember in the almost 14 years I've been in the department. And it happened really early in the north, with some lupin crops being completely stripped. I'll talk about that in a little bit, about why we think that happened and what we can maybe expect this year. But regardless of the normal pulse and canola crops that we worry about in terms of budworm, we had issues in cereals where we were finding some damage in most of it. I think was around sort of September, and maturing crops, but also the leaves were getting damaged. So we kind of investigated this a bit, and part of that was to go into some of these farmers' properties. And one of the, I think, major stories around this was a property at Balladoo, where I was able to go paddock to paddock with the farmer and sort of inspect crops with him, but also get a bit of a paddock history. And between the two of us, we quickly worked out there was a pretty solid story there about wild radish being the host of that in the first place, because native budworm really doesn't feed on cereals as a host. So we were curious, is this another species? And if it is, we need to be, because there's a lesser budworm species that does attack cereals. It didn't really have the physiological features like the white hairs in that. So we were wondering whether this is another species we're not used to. So we collected a lot of caterpillars specifically from cereals, but certainly where we were following up with the radish scenarios, it was where the radish was sprayed out and the caterpillars then transferred straight onto the wheat crops. They had nothing else to eat, so they had a nibble, and it caused a bit of confusion. What is this and why is it doing that? And we were worried, is it going to actually become a bigger problem? Is it going to spread from a few heads to a hectare sort of thing? So we wanted some conclusive, evidence as to what species these are. And with the caterpillars we collected, we had Monica Kehoe in our diagnostics labs to run some DNA barcodes on those, and all but one were Helicoverpa punctigera. So that's good news for us because it means that they are native budworm. They were there because of the radish and other sort of weeds that were there that were then sprayed out. And certainly the paddocks that still had radish in them, they had native budworm in the radish, but then walking further into the wheat, there was really not much there. So something to watch out for, especially this year where we're already finding budworm, which we'll talk about in a minute. So what can we expect this year? I mentioned that Svet's going to talk more about the non-Greenbridge pests, mites and lucerne flea, and I'll just talk a bit about the Greenbridge and what we can expect from that. It's particularly to do with caterpillars and aphids. So normally what we do about this time of year is get a good handle on what's going on with our rainfall. You can see January we didn't have much. February we had some welcome cyclonic activity, bringing some good soil moisture through. So you can see some areas there had in excess of 100 mils, particularly where it's kind of needed the most. So that was good news, but we had a bit of an indication of what this might produce in terms of scenarios. Last month, we had a bit of follow-up, not a huge amount, but mostly in the Esperance and Albany zones. And then over the last couple of weeks, we haven't really had much. And I just wanted to bring up this map here. In addition to looking at what's going on in the grain belt areas and getting a bit of a heads up, we also look further than that because a lot of our migratory moth species, they come from these northeastern agricultural regions, which is the predominant reason why we had such a big native budworm year last year was because we had a huge amount of rainfall out there northeast of the grain belt. And lo and behold, you can see northeast of Meriden, north of Kalgoorlie, some of those areas had in excess of 100 mils as well. And so we've had basically a scenario of over the last probably 4 weeks where people are finding caterpillars on all sorts of things, and some caterpillars that we don't normally see all that commonly, like weed web moth, pasture day moth. You know, they're not major pests, and so we're getting lots of caterpillars seen. It's funny, the media has picked up mostly on hawk moth caterpillars, which you can see in the top left photo there. I guess because they're brightly colored, they're big and plump, and people are always curious, what are these? Fortunately, they're really not, or very rarely, a pest, so we don't really have to worry about those. But the other pics you can see that people have been sending in, especially of budworm, is a little bit concerning. But it's worth noting that when it comes to moths and caterpillars, the eggs that are laid by moths, they must hatch or die. So we don't have a scenario where eggs are going to be laid, the Greenbridge will be broken, and then they will survive through to crop emergence. We really want to starve these out where we can. And we've also seen a lot of scenarios where heavy grazing really works well too. You know, conserving that Greenbridge for stock feed is an important thing for a lot of people too. So there are scenarios there that you can work in with that. But I think regardless of that, we should be certainly more vigilant this year when it comes to caterpillar pests, considering what we're seeing, and a lot of moths flying around at night. And so, yeah, we'll see. We'll just be vigilant with the Greenbridge in this sort of scenario. As part of a GRDC project that we are working on with SARDI, last month we did a pretty significant amount of surveillance to try and work out where are wild brassicas and self-sown canola, and can we find DBM on there, and can we get a better handle of the sort of how this works pre-season and then the lead-on risk through to the season. But big shout out to Minganu Irwin Group, West Midlands Group, and Levy Group have been very key players in getting this work done as well. So thank you very much. And you can see in the map the dots are where we did find a brassica. I mean, that could be a tiny little, anything from a tiny little two-leaf radish to, in some spots, sort of big bulky flowering radish, or in a bit of canola. But where the highlighted regions are where we did find diamondback moth. So interestingly, the northern egg region and the Esperance region historically can be major hotspots for DBM outbreaks. So we're going to follow up these. At every dot, we also have a diamondback moth trap placed, and we're following up on these to see not just where the caterpillars are, but what are we going to detect in terms of moths and try and work out the risk of this. So in terms of Greenbridge pests, I mentioned aphids as well. So we were keeping our eye out for aphids, and we found very few, which is, I guess, not too surprising, given the Greenbridge is quite recent, I suppose. One at Iniaba and one at Esperance of turnip aphid. So that's good news in the sense that we didn't find a lot of green peach aphids around as well that could be an issue in terms of bringing in some turnip yellows virus. And I'll just move on to fall armyworm and introduce us, I guess, to this new pest that we potentially have to deal with. You will have seen some media about it recently. It had been in the North and South American continents for a very long time, and never really, it's been intercepted in quarantine in Europe and Africa, but it wasn't until 2016 that it had established in Africa. So in just over the past 4 years, it had spread to North Queensland and then Northern Territory and now WA at the top end. So not a great place for it to go, considering the major crops it seems to be attacking the most is maize and sorghum. So there's maize getting damaged up there already. So I'll talk a bit about what sort of implications this might have for us specifically for the grains industry, because while we do have armyworm species, it's a little bit concerning that it has such a wide host range that cereals, canola, and pulses are on that list now, whereas the armyworms we do have traditionally are really only damaging cereals. So just a bit of background on the armyworm. You can see it's a pretty typical moth life cycle. It's in the same family as cutworms and native budworm and the other armyworm species that we have. And typically it lays eggs on the plants, and when they hatch, they can deceivingly be very small and cause sort of windowing damage. But similar to budworm, they consume greater than probably 90% food when they're a large grub. So that's that exponential growth that happens, and that's where that sort of devastating feeding damage happens over a pretty short period of time if it gets to those later instar stages. And then of course it pupates and then emerges as a moth. So how do we identify the fall armyworm, especially in relation to the ones that we already have? Some pictures here you can see. One thing to note is that caterpillar head. You can see that V shape. So that narrows it down from some of the other species, but you see the other pictures, it looks very plump. From a distance, people could probably confuse that as a plump cutworm. But fortunately, we do have some diagnostic characteristics that are pretty good, as opposed to some pests where we have to take them to the lab and do DNA work and all sorts of other stuff. We're hoping we can really just get a handle on this in the field. But you can see things like the 4 dots at the top of the back side. The line colorings in that, they talk about here, but the caterpillars can vary in color quite a lot, just like budworm do. They can be very green or very dark brown and sort of in between, depending on what they're feeding on and environmental characteristics and that sort of thing. But you can see that marking on the head region. They didn't mark it here, but there's a bit of a collar behind the head, which often we use as a diagnostic for at least a type of armyworm. But they're these sort of characteristics, and the dots at the top that are in that sort of pattern, we use that as well. Having said that, it is very similar to a species that we have, which shares the same genus. It's called Spodoptera latura, so very similar. And in terms of the moths, you can see some pictures here. The patterns and coloring is quite a bit different than native budworm, but the armyworm species would be a bit similar, and the males are a bit more brightly colored, as you can see. Now, what do we do if and when we get it? I pulled this chart from the GRDC webpage, and I think it's really good, not just because it shows what we can use in terms of permits through the APVMA for certainly cereals, pulses, and canola for us, but also it's really worth noting that it seems to be a really common theme that natural enemies are having a large impact on this pest where it's a big problem. So they're really trying to use selective options where they can and trying to harness their natural enemies. So this is what we have in terms of permits. So what are the implications for us specifically in the grains industry? I've just got some notes here. Apologize for all the text, but I think these are important points for us to sort of separate us from people that grow, maize and sorghum up north and things like that. So I mentioned that we already do have we have at least 4 species of armyworm, some of which even share the same genus, and they look very similar. But we have a host difference in this one, in that canola and pulses are on that list. Also, lucerne seems to be quite damaging to lucerne in the U.S. and also C4 grasses. There's been reports over there that they really prefer grasses. Having said that, there's 2 strains. One's a maize strain and one's a rice strain, and there's a bit of a difference in those as well. So fortunately, the identification is fairly straightforward, but I think it would be still important to send in images and samples just to get a second opinion from our taxonomist. And I think monitoring crops for fall armyworm, at least for cereals, would be probably a similar approach to what we're doing with our current armyworm species. But if we do find it shows up in canola and pulses and it's concerning, I think we're going to have to look into an approach for this and how we can tackle that. So we will be placing at least 8 fall armyworm pheromone traps out across the grain belt to give an idea, particularly over winter, spring, whether we're actually going to see this show up, because there's a lot of people suggesting that the species may not establish so well in our cold winter climate. But having said that, it is incredibly migratory in the U.S., where it migrates from the southern states. From there it can migrate to Canada in, they reckon, 30 hours. And that's probably what's happening to some of our current armyworm species. And certainly native budworm flies in from a long ways away too. So we want to see if it's going to show up. And we will continue to put updates through PestFax and other DPIRD media. But we do encourage people to, definitely send photos at least. But if you want to send samples, more than welcome. They're even better for us to get that under a microscope. And I think a really important point is we don't really know what strain this is yet, but a little bit concerning is overseas, it has an enormous potential to develop resistance to pretty much everything that we have going for us at the moment. Whether that's the case or not, I guess we'll find out in time. And we're keeping a very close watch on what's going on in the Kununurra area. And finally, just some points that I think are important as well. It's very hard to get information on damage of this species in cereals, pulses, and canola. I think partially because, fortunately, it's way lower on the list of preferred hosts. So I'm really hoping that works in our favor. Having said that, it really is a populations issue. Similar to budworm, if we get low numbers coming in a flight, often that doesn't amount to much, but where we have enormous numbers like we did last year, it was outbreak proportion. So this is how moths work, and this could be the case if we get a huge flight of the species. So we're going to keep on top of that. So Kansas State University's recommendations basically said that thresholds aren't very well established, but they go on these characteristics basically, and if there's significant defoliation or it begins feeding on seed pods, then they spray. So there's no clear-cut solution to it, and I think it's quite sporadic. And in wheat, they recommended if 25 to 30% of plants have feeding damage, to watch closely and control if plant stands are threatened. So again, I think it's going to be a case of looking for feeding damage and defoliation. If we're seeing any of that, get a closer look and get it identified. And I will pass on to Svet.
Hello, everyone. Well, it's been over a decade now that we've been undertaking surveillance for red-legged earth mites, and I thought we might just give a recap of where we're at, because this year we aren't actually going to be undertaking active surveillance, but if you do have a client or you yourself have a spray failure, please contact me and we can arrange for your site to be tested for resistance. But where did we start off with? It was back in 2006 that we actually had the first property at Esperance which was found to have a spray failure, and at that property in Esperance what we found was the mites were resistant to all insecticides in the synthetic pyrethroid group. However, they were susceptible to all insecticides within the OP group. We have continued surveillance over the years, and each year you can see the number of red dots have increased, red dots being resistant, white dots being where we've tested and not found resistance. By 2012, we had 29 sites where the red-legged earth mites were all resistant to synthetic pyrethroids, but still susceptible to the organophosphates. By 2016, we're at 41 sites. However, by this time, there's actually a bit of a change. I'll talk about that in a minute. But by the time we finished in 2019, we've got over 100 sites in our state where the red-legged earth mites are resistant to synthetic pyrethroids. The resistance is heritable, it persists over years. For 11 years of testing at the Esperance site, we were still finding red-legged earth mites that were still resistant to synthetic pyrethroids. And what we're finding is that synthetic pyrethroid resistance persists in the paddock, and you can actually find the resistance in mite populations throughout that paddock. However, it is paddock specific, and not every paddock on a property has SP resistance. However, what we did find was that it comes down to the spray regimes being put in place on that paddock. SP resistance is a recessive trait, so you do need to have two mites that have the resistant gene to have offspring that are resistant. If the paddocks are put back into pasture, what we did find is that there is a decrease in the number of mites that we find with SP resistance. However, what did change is in 2015, we found 11 sites across our state where the mites had a high tolerance to imethoate. And at 3 of those sites, the mites were also resistant to SPs. However, other insecticides in the OP range, apart from imethoate, still controlled these mites. In 2016, we found a single site where we had chlorpyrifos resistance. The mites were resistant to chlorpyrifos, but susceptible to insecticides in the SP range and also to other insecticides in the OP range. The farmer controlled that site extensively, and we could not detect chlorpyrifos resistance at that property. By the time we get to 2019, we had about 23 sites with omethorate resistance. Of those, over half also had SP resistance. And what we also did in 2019 was we also looked at chlorpyrifos resistance in sites that tested positive to omethorate resistance. Now, what the concerning thing is that if we look at the control population and you look at the level percentage of mortality on the y-axis, and along the x-axis you look at the concentration of omethorate in the control population, you can see we get control quite easily. If you get one of our resistant sites and do the same thing, you'll see that there is about 100 times difference in the LD50, which is the dose it takes to kill off 50% of the population in our resistant site. But what was actually concerning is that you can see on the far right here that we are getting survivors at the highest rate of omethorate tested. The other concerning thing is that when we took these sites, we did 12 sites, I'm only showing you 2 because they showed a very similar trend in that if you look at where the field rate is, you can see that our resistant sites had survivors at the field rate of chlorpyrifos and still had survivors at the highest rate that we tested. That means that these red-legged earth mites are not being effectively controlled by OPs or SPs, and we are very limited in what we can do. What some of the things that some of the growers who are having those issues are looking at is putting pastures back into the rotation, because omethorate resistance is a metabolic response. So if you do stop spraying OPs, over a period of time it's expected that the mites will become more susceptible. However, that doesn't work for everybody, and they are looking at ways to manage mites without having the need to spray. And it should also be noted that the majority of growers that do have resistance in their red-legged earth mites didn't actually spray for them, and a lot of the sprays are being applied in season for other pests. The insecticides that are going in with the knockdown are not necessarily being sprayed at the time that red-legged earth mites hatch, and you should all be aware that red-legged earth mites hatch when there's been about 5 mil of rain over 5 consecutive days, and at the same time 10 days of average temperatures below 16 degrees. So if you've got those criteria and you're putting a knockdown and a insecticide with it, you'll get a good control of the red-legged earth mites that are hatching. However, in a majority of cases that hasn't occurred. But what about the other mites and lucerne flea? So we do have 3 other pest mites, Bullorstium, Bryobium and brown wheat mite. Bullorstium mite, again, does not have a temperature requirement. It also doesn't have a diapause stage, an obligatory diapause stage like red-legged earth mites. So red-legged earth mites, for instance, have a diapause stage over summer and they are not around at all. Whereas Bullorstium, Bryobium, brown wheat mite, if there's any green plant material, you'll find them. If in the absence of green plant material, they're not there. They're actually undergoing diapause in an egg stage. And as soon as there's sufficient rain, they'll hatch again. The thing with these mites is that even if there isn't a green bridge, they can still hatch. And the only time that they really cause damage is to emerging seedling crops. Most times a crop that is undergoing good growing conditions and it's cold and wet, these mites are not a problem. The Bryobium mite and the brown wheat mite look very similar in their actual, the way they look. So they both have these long forelegs, which you can see by the green arrows, and their front legs are twice the size of their other legs. The difference between them is the Bryobium mite, you'll find it on clovers and on canola. The brown wheat mite is on cereals. The issue with the brown wheat mite is we have had them causing damage to the flag leaf, especially in barley, and where we don't know what the yield loss is potentially going to be. However, it's really important to look at how widespread the brown wheat mite actually is in the crop. What we tend to find is it's very sporadic and very patchy, and its damage is more likely to occur when we have a dry start to spring. And again, it's been exacerbated because at the same time, there may have been other factors affecting the crop. So if you are going to spray, bear in mind that the controls for the Borrelia mites are the same, but for Blausium mite, it's synthetic pyrethroids only. Lucerne flea, however, is one that over the years we're getting quite a lot of calls about. These particular pests can be present in summer. They have a diapause stage and it's based on in spring when temperatures and things start to dry out. The females actually lay eggs encased in clay, and it is the following year or whenever it occurs that rain falls down and breaks down that clay around the eggs and initiates hatching of those eggs. The issue is that you can have a staggered hatching in a paddock, and it can coincide with the knockdown, but it can also coincide with the germinating crops, and control can be very difficult. Some growers have found that if they have effectively managed the lucerne flea the previous year, they do get less the following year. However, what we're finding is that in paddocks that have been clayed or in paddocks where there is naturally occurring clay, you can actually find that the lucerne flea can actually spread from one part of the paddock where it used to be to another part, and we do get a lot of growers and agronomists getting caught out by the fact that they can move. The mites, Blausium borrelia and the wheat mite can be found in high numbers if there's a green bridge, but don't forget, even if you don't have a green bridge, you can still have them in coinciding with a germinating crop. They are present in the same paddocks. They can move, the lucerne flea especially, and bear in mind that for the lucerne flea and the Borrelia mites, the same controls do work. The issue is that if you're applying an OP onto a germinating crop, you don't get very good control. And other ones that we're not getting very good control with at the moment are snails and slugs. We've had reports in the last few weeks of baiting occurring, especially in the Albany and Esperance port zones, but not getting very good kills. Our modelling has shown that when you're looking at the best time to bait for these pests is just before they lay eggs, because what you want to do is you want to stop them from building up their populations. What we've found in the past 3 years with a project that's been co-funded, which has been run by SARDI, but which we've been involved with, funded by GRDC, has been that if you have a rain event in summer, you do not get egg laying occurring. The albumin gland, which needs to be developed for egg laying to occur, only starts to develop from March and April. So if you see this graph here, we've got albumin gland length on the y-axis and the months on the x-axis. And each month we dissected snails to figure out what the length of the albumin gland was. In 2017, we actually had in February a rain event greater than, cumulative rain events of greater than 50 mils. So we had actually had a green bridge. However, it's only from March to April that you see the albumin gland actually increasing in size. 2018, it was a very dry summer. There was no rain event in March. But again, from March to April, you see the albumin gland starting to develop in size. And the same thing in 2019. We've looked at when the albumin gland starts to develop, and you can see that in that shaded area, it is really starting to develop from March to April. At Gibson, which is the yellow line, you can actually see that it's in late April to May that it's actually starting to increase in size. So there is some variability in sites, but as a general rule, from March to April is time that the gland starts to increase, and you need to bait then, because once that gland is developed, the snails are actively laying eggs. And the one thing we've been asked constantly is, Is it the same for the round snails? Yes, it's exactly the same for the round snails, but not for slugs. We've looked at the same thing for slugs, like looking at the size of the albumin gland to determine when slugs are laying eggs. The issue is the black-keeled slug, when we detect it in paddocks, the gland is fully developed and they're usually already laying eggs. Currently, we do have reticulated slugs out in paddocks laying eggs. We are actively monitoring cameras at Mount Barker and at Esperance, and hopefully we'll be able to continue that over the next few weeks to give an indication of when egg laying has occurred for the snails. Currently, they're actively moving and actively feeding under cameras, but again, one of the biggest issues with snails is that baits do cause variable mortality. So we did a baiting trial for 2 years running where we took snails from the field, fed them baits, and basically what we found was that in April 2017 we got 90% mortality, but at the same time the following year we only got 20% mortality, and it just shows that when you bait, you do get variable kills and you do need to budget for more than one bait in a paddock. For snails, it's best to bait before seeding and post seeding, whereas with slugs, you can get away with a single bait after seeding, but only if the slugs have all emerged and are actively feeding. The issue with our slugs is we've got two types: the reticulated slug, which lives above the soil and it becomes active once there's rain. However, the black keel slug has a burrowing habit and forms a mucus-lined chamber underground. That chamber, when it breaks down in the advent of rain, is when the slugs become actively moving, and that can be patchy in a paddock, which is why you'll sometimes find that you'll get a really good kill of black keel slugs and come back later and they've actually decimated a crop because you've killed off one wave but not the second or third. We are also finding that a lot of growers are calibrating their spreading and really looking at making sure that they've got a good even spread of baits in a paddock. You do need to have more than 30 bait points per square metre to get a really good kill. That can be difficult to achieve if you haven't calibrated the spreaders, but the more even the spread, the better your kill rate is. And also, having said that, most people are already on board and making sure that they've killed off all the weeds in paddocks before baiting, because once a crop is up or once weeds are up, the baits compete with the green plants to attract the slugs and snails. And with the small pointed snail especially, it's random encounter that gets them to feed on the bait. It's not that they smell the bait and come across it, as is the case with the garden snail. So hopefully with everybody that's put baits out, you are going back and checking to make sure that you are getting a kill around the baits, because it's highly likely you may need to do more than one bait. And aerial baiting or ground baiting, look, they both work as well as each other as long as you've got an even spread of baits. And talking about baiting to control pests, we do have millipedes, slaters and European earwigs, which are resident pests, and they do cause quite a lot of damage each year, slaters and European earwigs especially. But with the Portuguese millipede, which is again an introduced pest, we're finding that the damage from it is quite variable. In the pot trials we've done, we had over 100 millipedes and they caused minimal damage to a germinating canola plant. European earwigs and slaters are a bit more difficult to kill. They are also introduced, so we do have native slaters, and you can tell if they're a native slater is if you pick it up in your hands and it doesn't roll up into a ball. It's usually one of our native ones, where if it rolls up into a ball, it's a pill bug. Portuguese millipede, European earwigs, slaters are more likely to be introduced onto farms from towns, as are the snails. They're difficult to, European earwigs especially can be difficult to control their spread because they're very good flyers, but do make sure you get your identification correct for the earwigs. European earwigs have yellow legs with yellow shoulders. We have had people baiting for native earwigs, which can also be found in high numbers. in paddocks at times, but look, they're brown earwig, no wings and no yellow on the shoulders. And they're also a bit stouter, but that's hard to tell when you're just looking at them singly in a paddock. European earwigs, you'll find that they will be in really high numbers, and if you pick them up or you move something, you'll see that there's quite a lot of them. The native earwigs, you won't find them living in such big family groups, but do get your identifications correct because control is difficult for all of them. And at the moment, we've only got one bait that's registered, and it's only registered in non-crop areas. So it's not effectively going to control pests in a germinating crop at this time, but hopefully it will be registered for use in canola in the coming, hopefully it'll be this year, and we can actually use it to protect crops. But it's just something to bear in mind that you may be able to apply it in non-crop areas where we actually do have earwigs, slaters and Portuguese millipedes harbouring. Now, Cindy will talk about what's coming up next and what apps we've got.
Yes, thank you, Svet. So I'm going to talk first about the PestFax service. We do provide quite a few resources and tools. And one of the main things that we produce is the PestFax newsletter that during the growing season we distribute weekly or as needed during the growing season. And in this newsletter, we talk about what green pests or diseases are being reported. So we alert people to what they should be looking out for. We also provide information on how to identify, manage, and where to find more information about plant insect pests and plant diseases. So if you have not subscribed for our PestFax newsletter, please feel free to email us at the email address on the screen and do so. We also have a PestFax map, and this displays all the plant insect pests and plant diseases that have been reported to us since basically 1996, roundabouts, and you can select, as you can see on the screen, you can select what you want to view on the map and for what time period. And this is a very widely used tool. We have thousands of maps generated by the public each year. We also provide a free diagnosis of insect pests and plant diseases that you find in your crops and pastures. And you can send these to us in a variety of ways. We really do like to hear what you are seeing out in the field. One way is that you can use our free PestFax Reporter app. There's a picture of the app on the screen, and you can take, if you take some really good, clear, close-up photos of the insect or disease, as well as the plant symptoms or damage, and send it to us, and then we can get back to you in regards to that. Or you can email your queries to us at the PestFax email address, or you can phone us directly. We also provide free insecticide spray guides. We do 2 each year. We have an autumn-winter and a winter-spring spray guides, and we are in the process of publishing the 2020 autumn-winter spray guide. So watch this space, that is coming very shortly. We also provide a native budworm trapping program later in the season. But for more information about the PestFax service, feel free to go to this webpage address that's on the screen and read a bit more about what we do and how we might be able to help you with your cropping program this year. The department has quite a few apps that can assist you with identifying and managing insect pests in your crops and pastures. And this is just some of the DPIRD apps. There are a lot more out there in the industry, and we do promote these in the PestFax newsletter. So if you want to get an identification or report an insect, you can use the PestFax Reporter app, and you can use this for plant diseases and weeds as well. More of a focus on the plant, on the insects and diseases. Or you could use the My Pest Guide Reporter. And the My Pest Guide Reporter can be used for basically any situation. If you find a pest in your household or in your garden, or if it's an exotic pest. But basically, we are very grateful for any reports that we receive. We also have the My Pest Guide Crops app. And basically, if you enter the pest features or crop symptoms into this app, it can give you a result of what that pests might be. We also have some apps that will help you with making in-field decisions. We have the Snapbait app, which Svet previously mentioned, and that's used for calibrating your snail bait spreaders. We also have the Snapcard app, which helps with applying pesticides. And we also have the Crop Scout app, which can help you manage aphids in your canola crops by helping you assess numbers, distribution in the paddock, and help you make decisions if and where you need to spray. And that moves us into the question and answer session of the webinar. And if you still have a question that you haven't entered, please feel free to do so under the chat section. And please don't panic. If you think of a question after this webinar is finished, please feel free, just email it through to us at the email address. And I'm just going to unmute our presenters, and I'm going to read out the questions, and we are, between Svet, Dusty and I, we will attempt to answer your questions. So the first question that came in was about what insect pests might be a problem in paddocks that have been in pasture for 2 years and are clay soil type but have been clean of weeds for a month following knockdown spray. So I'm not sure who would like to tackle that one, Dusty or Svet.
I'm happy to start with that one. So weevils is the first thing that comes to mind with things like capeweed, often where there's weevil damage, and they're often associated with these sorts of weeds that have been, killed off for a long time, but they have the potential to go dormant like that. So yeah, and also because they're much harder to kill, they take higher rates. And so what people normally use for other species, they get caught out for that. So I think yeah, that's definitely something to look out for. But as Svet mentioned, the non-Greenbridge pests, sort of like regardless, we have this issue with mites and lucerne flea, and where we have continuous pasture and timerite hasn't been taken into account and all that sort of stuff, you have a much higher egg load. So we often say, yeah, with even 1 year of pasture, if you're going to sow canola, something as susceptible as that, you should probably be looking out for egg loads. Wouldn't you agree, Svet?
Yes, I do.
What about the south?
Yes,
what about the South Coast, Svet?
South Coast has been pretty patchy in terms of where Greenbridges are actually present, but what we're finding is that even in paddocks where everything has looked brown and everyone's told me it's been very well, had really good weed control, we've actually found that weed control can be quite patchy, and it depends on the patchiness as to what you can get. And we have actually found that even in places where they've said, no, we've had no clover, and I've been scratching my head, you go out there and you find, yes, they've actually had patches of clover. It's been very small, and those small patches of clover have been enough to have a population of bryobiomite that have then been able to move on to a germinating canola crop that's subsequently become moisture stressed. So it's one of these things where it can be quite an interesting scenario.
Thank you, Dusty and Svet. And we have had a few fall armyworm questions come through. So Dusty, I might just perhaps give you control. The first question is a comment that in regards to your insecticide table for what was registered for fall armyworm, the comment was that it's interesting to note that there is no green option for control registered in cereals. So I'm not sure if you're able to bring that back on your screen, Dusty. I'll just give you.
Yeah, I don't really know why that is, but for various reasons, the APVA may certainly treat cereals different than other crops. I really don't have a solid answer for that as to what that is. But talking to consultants about this sort of thing, like one thing that's worth noting in WA, at least in terms of legislation, what is registered for other pests in that crop, you can use in that crop. And we've been able to get around things like that for, say, vegetable weevil. Rates used for Bolostium mites have also taken care of vegetable weevil. So I mean, there's other options too. If we run into problems, I think we will be looking at what's registered for the other armyworm species. Is it going to be just as effective?
Okay, thanks, Dusty. Another question in regards to fall armyworm. The question was asked, do you think fall armyworm can be seen towards the south coast of WA in 2020?
Well, it's really hard to say. The migratory patterns of native budworm and Spodoptera latura would suggest that it's very possible for it to make its way down here in a short period of time, I think. We'd have to really look into the weather patterns, I suppose, but it's definitely a possibility.
Okay, thanks, Dusty. And another fall armyworm is very hot in the questions. With Australia mainly growing grains over winter, particularly with winters starting to become warming quickly and for longer, would this increase or reduce the risk for fall armyworm?
I'm guessing that has a bit to do with climate change. Our biggest worry with migratory moth species is climate change is causing more sporadic summer rainfall events, which would have an even more larger impact, I think, in terms of all this, not just for moths, but also things like locusts. We've had freak events like the spur-throated locust come down on summer rain events and wreak havoc in pastures. So what it would do in season and that sort of thing, I'd probably be more worried on when things start warming up after winter, and whether it's going to act similar to our other armyworm species.
Okay. Thank you, Dusty. And the next question for fall armyworm is, given tight insecticide supply, should growers carry extra stock due to increased risk of fall armyworm?
To tell you the truth, I'm only hearing rumors about what sort of stocks are out there. We don't sort of keep tabs on that, but considering the current situations that we're in, so I'm actually less worried about fall armyworm in terms of the season and what's going to damage crops, and I'm more worried about the main pest moths that we're getting at the moment. So it's certainly here we have to be much more vigilant with caterpillar pests. So yeah, as say compared to last year, where we had a very late break and that sort of thing, I think we will be probably reducing our risks a lot more this year.
And we have another fall armyworm question. Will the fall armyworm traps also catch other armyworm species?
Yes, we're trying to keep on tabs with this. I know Melina Miles gave a talk on this, which was really good. They're getting, I think, one more species in their trap, and Helen Spafford, our entomologist up in Kununurra, she was finding one other species as well. So I think it's not absolutely specific, but there is a chance in our traps. There's a chance we will get other species, and so we'll need to be on top of that.
Great, thanks, Dusty. And I think that might be the time we have for today. There is a couple more questions, but we can follow them up via email. And as I mentioned, we will be circulating a copy of the webinar and the PowerPoint slides. And that brings us to the end of our webinar today. I'd like to say a big thank you to our presenters, Dusty and Svet, for presenting today. And we would like to thank you, all the attendees, for joining us today for this PestFax webinar. And we hope that you have a great start to the season. And goodbye.